By the time HOA Curran decided to file a bogus lien on my sprawling 3,200-acre ranch, I already had the FBI digging into her $2.3 million mineral rights scam. With evidence neatly documented and her confession captured on tape, she assumed she was swiping from some naive farmer. What she didn't realize was that this farmer had been quietly building a federal case against her. Picture it. You're tightening a fence post on land your great-grandfather homesteaded 6 decades ago. The morning mist drifts across pastures where 3 generations of your family have raised cattle. You smell the fresh hay, hear your Angus calling in the distance, and feel gravel crunch beneath boots that have traveled this path countless times. Then you open your mailbox and find a certified letter that turns your world upside down, a notice of property sale. Your 3,200 acres sold at auction over unpaid HOA. Fees of $847. That's exactly what happened to Jake Riverside, and what he did next didn't just topple a corrupt HOA. It sent shockwaves across the whole system. What would you do if strangers legally sold your family's heritage while you were at work? Drop a comment and share where you're watching from, because this story proves that sometimes the quietest people strike back the hardest. Jake Riverside, 52, a third-generation cattle rancher, had hands calloused from honest labor. His great-grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1960, back when claiming a piece of the American dream required nothing but sweat, grit, and determination. The rolling hills stretched endlessly, bisected by a creek that never ran dry, dotted with black Angus who recognized Jake's voice from a quarter-mile away. After a divorce 2 years ago, Jake split his time between the ranch and his work as a diesel mechanic in town. The mechanic job covered bills while the cattle operation slowly regained its footing. His 2 teenage children, Emma and Tyler, spent weekends mending fences and feeding livestock. It wasn't glamorous, but it was. There's then Marlene Whitfield moved in. Marlene, 58, had arrived from California 5 years earlier with her tech executive husband and an attitude big enough to power their entire smart home. She purchased a lot in Meadowbrook Estates, a 47-home luxury development built on what used to be the Johnson family's wheat fields. Within 6 months, she became HOA president. Within a year, she was making everyone's life miserable. Those cattle are an eyesore, Marlene declared during her first visit to Jake's porch, her designer heels clacking against the weathered wood like a countdown to chaos. Her perfume hit Jake like a chemical assault, clashing violently with the honest scent of hay and livestock. Property values in our community depend on certain standards, she lectured. Jake held the leather-bound property deed passed down from his grandfather, feeling its familiar heft in his roughened hands. Ma'am, with respect, your community ends at that fence line. This has been cattle country long before you were born. Marlene didn't hear him. She had already started plotting. The harassment began subtly. Jake's mailbox was knocked over twice in a month. His cattle gate was left open, sending 30 head of Angus wandering down the county road. Anonymous complaints flooded the county offices, citing unsightly agricultural activity and potential health hazards. Then came the property assessor, looking perplexed as he walked Jake's land with a GPS. Sir, I hate to tell you this, but according to our records, parts of your property have been reclassified. Reclassified as what? Jake asked, incredulous. Part of Meadowbrook Estates' HOA jurisdiction, updated in 2019 due to abandoned agricultural status. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. The bitter taste matched his frustration as he pored over legal documents until 2 a.m. by lamplight. Abandoned? He had run cattle on this land continuously for 15 years, paid every tax bill, maintained every fence, and filed every agricultural exemption. Yet somehow, miraculously, His 3,200 acres were now listed in the county registry under Marlene's HOA domain. No notice, no hearing. One day the land was his. The next, it belonged to a suburban development that hadn't even existed when his great-grandfather first broke ground. The morning dew and diesel fumes couldn't mask the stench of corruption in the county courthouse. And Marlene? She was just getting started. You have 30 days to comply with architectural guidelines. Her next certified letter warned, or face daily fines of $50. Your barn is a non-conforming structure and must be removed or modified to meet community standards. Jake stood in the very spot where his great-grandfather had first surveyed their slice of paradise, watching the sunset over land that had sustained 3 generations. The cattle settled for the night, their soft noises blending with the whisper of the wind through tall grass. He had no idea yet, but he was about to discover something that would change everything. This wasn't about property, lines, or neighborhood rules. It was about cash, a lot of it. And Marlene Whitfield was more than ready to seize a man's entire legacy to get her share. Threatening Jake's barn was just the opening act. Things escalated faster than dry grass catching fire in August. It began with a cease and desist letter, stamped with the HOS official seal, delivered by a process server who clearly wished he were anywhere else. The letter demanded the immediate removal of all non-compliant agricultural structures, Jake's barn, his equipment shed, and somehow even his grandfather's original water well. "Ma'am," the server said, shifting nervously on Jake's porch, "I've served a lot of papers, but this one's unusual." The scent of freshly cut grass from the HOA was obsessively trimmed. Common areas drifted across the property line like an unwanted invader. Jake could hear the relentless hum of industrial mowers keeping lawns so perfect they looked fake. "Nothing," says community, like a $500 fine for the wrong mailbox color. He thought, grim, but Marlene had connections. Her husband, tech executive Bradford Whitfield, had friends in all the right places. Within a week, a county inspector appeared unannounced, clipboard in hand, frowning like he'd seen this kind of mess before. "Sir, according to our records, this land has been part of Meadowbrook Estate subdivision since 2019, Inspector Morrison." Sad, squinting at his tablet with a practiced look of disbelief, Jake felt his blood pressure spike. "Impossible. I've been paying property taxes on this land for 15 years. Morrison turned the tablet toward him. There it was, black and white, 3,200 acres listed under HOA management, classified as residential agricultural instead of pure agricultural. The change was dated April 15th, 2019. Jake remembered that date. He hadn't been deployed with the National Guard for tornado relief. He'd been at Morrison's Diesel every single day, with timesheets to prove it. Years ago, a mechanic buddy had taught him this trick. When county records are updated administratively, the owner doesn't always get notified, especially if the property looks abandoned. One careless clerk downtown could essentially steal your land with a few keystrokes, and you'd never know until it was too late. "This is fraud," Jake said quietly, his voice heavy with 3 generations of honest work. Morrison shrugged, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Guilt? Fear? "I just enforce what's in the system, sir. You'll need to take it up with the county clerk's office." Jake's response was precise and methodical. 15 years of mechanical work had taught him that every problem had a solution if tackled systematically. He hired Kowalski Land Surveying, the same firm his grandfather had trusted in the 1960s. Pete Kowalski's son now ran the business and remembered those original survey stakes. "Your great-granddad drove these markers deep, Jake. Let's see if they're still there." They were. And when Pete Jr. ran modern GPS equipment along the original boundaries, something remarkable appeared. The HOA's prized common area the perfect strip of manicured grass between the development and the county road actually sat 50 feet inside Jake's property line. Well, I'll be damned, Pete Jr. muttered, double-checking his readings. According to the original federal homestead grant, the HOA had built their main entrance on Jake's land, but Jake's move was clever. Instead of confronting Marlene immediately, he dug into her background. He found she'd been fired from her HR job in California after a discrimination lawsuit. Even more revealing, Inspector Morrison lived in Meadowbrook Estates, just 2 houses down from Marlene. Jake's response was surgical. He filed a counter-complaint against the HOA's unpermitted storm drainage system and erected no trespassing private property signs right through the middle of their manicured entrance. When Marlene's Lexus squealed into his driveway, Jake was ready. "You cannot put those signs here," she shrieked, her voice climbing higher than a rusty gate. Hinge. Jake leaned against his truck, a manila folder in hand, calm and unshaken. "According to the original survey, ma'am, your community's entrance has been encroaching on my property for the past 5 years, but that's not the shocking part." He opened the folder, exposing Morrison's work history and home address. The real shocker was how county inspectors, residents of your HOA, kept discovering issues with properties you were trying to acquire. Marlene's complexion drained. She hadn't anticipated Jake would connect the dots so quickly. That evening, Jake reached out to his ex-wife, Patricia. As a paralegal, she had seen enough property disputes to recognize a pattern immediately. "Jake, this isn't random harassment," she said. "This is methodical title fraud. Someone has been orchestrating this for a long time." Outside, his cattle were settling in for the night, but Jake was just warming up. The faint tick of his old truck cooling blended with the distant hum of the HOA's security lights. Everything seemed tranquil, yet Jake realized he was facing far more than petty neighborhood squabbles. Tomorrow, he would uncover just how deep this conspiracy ran. Marlene hated being trapped. Like most bullies, she intensified her attacks when confronted. Within 48 hours of Jake exposing the property line issue, the HOA Board 5 members, handpicked by Marlene, held an emergency session to address ongoing violations at 47,250 County Road 18. That was Jake's property, and he wasn't invited to defend himself. Jake obtained the meeting minutes through a public records request. They read like a list of charges: $50 per day for non-compliant agricultural structures, another $50 for failing to maintain approved landscaping standards. Somehow, his cattle were deemed unauthorized livestock, subject to daily fines until removed. The totals were staggering: $12,000 in retroactive fees dating back to 2019, plus ongoing daily penalties. Patricia, always sharp, immediately saw the real trap. "They're not trying to collect money, Jake. They're manufacturing a debt large enough to justify foreclosure." Legal papers and desperation filled Jake's kitchen as he spread documents across his grandfather's old oak table. Every bill, tax payment, and agricultural certification from the past 15 years. If they wanted a paper war, he would give. Them one, Marlene wasn't done flexing her influence. Her next move was insidious. She convinced the county to label Jake's cattle as nuisance animals requiring special permits. Suddenly, the livestock that had grazed these fields for decades were illegal. Jake responded by hiring Sarah Bennett, the sharpest real estate attorney within 100 miles. Sarah, raised on a farm before law school, understood both agriculture and legal warfare. Her first move was ingenious. She requested a complete title history dating back to the original homestead grant. "Jake," Sarah said, voice controlled, but tight with anger as she reviewed the files, "someone in the county clerk's office has been busy. Your property wasn't accidentally added to the HOA registry. It was deliberately targeted." The smoking gun was hiding in plain sight. The administrative correction transferring Jake's land had been signed by Deputy County Clerk Rebecca Torres. Sarah discovered that Torres lived at 1247 Meadowbrook Lane, 3 houses down from Marlene. The correction was processed on April 15th, 2019, the exact day Torres returned from a Eusebio San Lucas vacation she reportedly took with Marlene Whitfield. Jake recalled his grandfather's advice: when you're working on an engine, follow the connections. Everything links to something else. The same principle applied to corruption, you just had to know where to look. Jake's mechanical mind became an asset. He meticulously documented every detail, conversations recorded, legal in his state, interactions photographed, all mail cataloged with TIME STAMPS. His breakthrough came from an unexpected ally, Betty Morrison, an 83-year-old widow whose property bordered Jake's eastern line. Betty had her own HO, a dispute over her late husband's workshop, which Marlene claimed violated building codes. Despite being grandfathered for 30 years, they tried the same tactic with Pete Kowalski's horse pasture, Betty told Jake. Over coffee at Murphy's Diner, her hands steady despite age. Same pattern, same clerk, same mysterious corrections in the county records. Even the burnt taste of Murphy's coffee couldn't mask the bitter truth. This wasn't random harassment. This was a coordinated effort targeting rural properties near Meadowbrook Estates. Jake's own issues were small in comparison. Sarah's title search exposed the full scope. Between 2019 and 2021, 3 additional properties totaling nearly 800 acres had been administratively added to HOA jurisdiction. All occurred while the owners were away or distracted, all signed by Rebecca Torres. All properties were valuable for development or strategic for subdivision expansion. The turning point came when Sarah discovered that the HOA's financial records were public. Late one night, Jake hunched over the spreadsheets, the clatter of his aging printer laboring through page after page of evidence filling the room. One line item immediately grabbed his attention: legal consulting fees, $847,000 over 3 years. $847,000 in legal bills for a 47-home subdivision. That worked out to almost $18,000 per house each year, enough to buy a solid truck. But the real shocker was the payee, Whitfield and Associates Legal Services, run by Bradford Whitfield's brother-in-law. Jake leaned back, listening to the distant lowing of his cattle settling for the night, and a slow smile spread across his face, the first in weeks. Marlene hadn't merely been misappropriating property. She had been funneling HOA funds to relatives while inventing legal crises to justify those outrageous fees. Tomorrow, he planned to start connecting all the dots, and when he was done, Marlene would regret ever crossing paths with Jake Riverside. Marlene's next move betrayed her panic. Desperate people make foolish decisions, and she was about to make a monumental one. Bradford Whitfield's tech connections weren't just for show. Within days of Sarah uncovering the financial discrepancies, Jake was visited by the state fire marshal, the EPA, and even the IRS, all citing anonymous tips about environmental violations, unsafe chemical storage, and undeclared agricultural income. The fire marshal found nothing. The diesel storage tank was fully permitted and inspected annually. The EPA reluctantly admitted that Jake's rotational grazing system actually improved water quality after testing his creek. But the IRS audit was built to punish, regardless of innocence. Even law-abiding taxpayers could be financially devastated by a drawn-out federal investigation. Jake's ex-wife, Patricia, observed him sorting through mountains of receipts at the kitchen table, the air thick with the scent of old paper and tension. This isn't random. Jake, someone with serious influence is systematically trying to destroy you. But Jake approached the problem like a mechanic. When multiple systems fail at once, There's usually a single underlying cause. He hired a private investigator, a retired state trooper named Buck Hawkins, who specialized in white-collar crime. Buck's findings revealed a striking, troubling truth. Bradford Whitfield's tech company, Horizon Data Solutions, had recently partnered with Chesapeake Energy Development to provide geographic data analysis for acquiring mineral rights. In simpler terms, they use satellite imaging and geological surveys to pinpoint valuable land for energy extraction. Jake's ranch wasn't just dirt, it sat atop one of the county's largest natural gas deposits, estimated at $2.3 million in extraction rights over 10 years. The geological survey had been completed 18 months prior. The harassment of Jake began 6 months later. They weren't trying to steal your land, Buck explained, his gravelly voice carrying decades of law enforcement experience. They wanted your mineral rights, push the land into HOA foreclosure, then lease the gas rights to Chesapeake. Marlene's undoing came through her own arrogance. During a heated HOA board meeting secretly recorded by Jake's ally, Betty Morrison, Marlene erupted, "We've invested too much time and money in this project to let some hillbilly farmer ruin everything." Her voice rang clear on the recording. "Bradford's contacts at Chesapeake expect those mineral rights by December. We can't afford delays." Betty, 83 and determined, captured the entire 40-minute meeting on her grandson's phone. Marlene had just confessed to conspiracy and mineral rights fraud, revealing her greed-driven motives, but the ultimate breakthrough came when Sarah uncovered a legal trump card. Jake's great-grandfather's original homestead grant contained federal anti-speculation protections that were still legally enforceable. Any fraudulent attempt to acquire homestead land for commercial development violated both state and federal law. "This isn't just fraud anymore," Sarah said, spreading the 1960s documents across the kitchen table, her voice tight with excitement. "This is federal. The FBI takes homestead violations very seriously." Jake sipped his coffee, hope mingling with the bitter brew as he read the deed. His great-grandfather had been clever, ensuring the land stayed in the family and couldn't be exploited by speculators. 3 generations later, those protections were about to save the ranch. Jake's counterstrike was swift and decisive. Sarah filed a quiet title action to completely clear his property deed, stripping the HOA of any authority. She also sued the HOA for fraudulent liens and attempted theft. The final blow was her complaint to the FBI's white-collar crime division about systematic homestead fraud. Jake expanded his coalition. Pete Kowalski's horse ranch had also been targeted. Betty Morrison's workshop came under attack. 3 other rural landowners discovered their properties had been quietly absorbed into HOA jurisdiction. Together, they formed what Jake privately called the Grudge Squad 7 landowners, 3,000 combined acres and enough legal firepower to challenge Meadowbrook Estates. The local community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Murphy's Diner began serving justice coffee, with all proceeds directed to Jake's legal defense fund. The hardware store hung a sign declaring, "We stand with rural property rights." Even the president of the local bank, whose family had farmed these lands for 4 generations, openly supported Jake's cause. Yet the real pressure came from an unexpected quarter, the local newspaper. Editor Tom Bradley, whose own grandfather had lost his farm to eminent domain abuses in the 1980s, turned Jake's fight into a personal crusade. The headline series, "Rural Landowners Resist Corporate Land Grabs," dominated the front page and was later picked up by agricultural journals statewide. Marlene was about to learn that swindling farmers and farm country was like poking a hornet's nest, and Jake was only getting started. Everything changed with a phone call on a Tuesday morning while Jake was repairing a broken gate hinge. Sarah's voice came through the line, crackling with barely contained excitement. "Jake, you need to sit down for this." My title search traced back to the original federal land grant, and what I found is going to blow your mind. Jake set his welding torch aside, the sharp scent of heated metal mingling with the morning dew as he walked toward his truck. What kind of blow my mind? He asked. The mineral rights kind. Your great-grandfather's homestead grant doesn't just cover the surface, it includes everything beneath. Oil, gas, coal, you name it. And there's a geological survey from 18 months ago showing huge natural gas deposits right under your property. The world tilted slightly as Jake absorbed the news. His great-grandfather, a man who'd never owned anything more luxurious than a Ford pickup, had unwittingly secured mineral rights potentially worth millions. How much are we talking? Jake asked. Conservative estimate? $2.3 million over 10 years if the gas rights are properly leased, Sarah replied. But here's the kicker, someone else already knew about it. Sarah's research uncovered the real conspiracy. Horizon Data Solutions, Bradford Whitfield's tech company, had been contracted by Chesapeake Energy to pinpoint properties with valuable mineral deposits using satellite geological analysis. Jake's ranch had been marked as a high priority acquisition target in a report from 15 months ago. The harassment hadn't been random petty tyranny. It had been industrial espionage followed by a massive attempted theft. They weren't trying to steal my farm, Jake said slowly, a chill running through him. They were trying to steal my great-grandfather's legacy and turn it into their retirement fund. But the revelations kept coming. Buck Hawkins' investigation revealed that Chesapeake Energy had already drafted preliminary extraction plans for Jake's property, complete with access roads, drilling sites, and pipelines, all assuming Meadowbrook Estates Development Corporation would own the land by January 2025. Marlene hadn't been playing HOA games. She had been orchestrating a multi-million-dollar heist under the guise of suburban property management. The emotional impact hit Jake like a sledgehammer. For months, he had believed he was battling minor bureaucratic squabbles over codes and property lines. Instead, he had been defending his family's entire legacy from corporate thieves who viewed his great-grandfather's hard work as a mere business opportunity. Sarah's voice softened as she delivered the final piece of the puzzle. Jake, there's something else. The federal anti-speculation clauses in your original homestead grant aren't just protective, they're punitive. Anyone attempting to fraudulently acquire homestead land for commercial gain faces federal prosecution and treble damages. Treble damages? That meant Marlene and her co-conspirators could owe Jake 3 times the amount they tried to steal. 3 times $2.3 million. Nearly $7 million in potential recovery. Jake sat in his truck, listening to his cattle moving across the pastures his great-grandfather had cleared by hand 60 years ago. That old man had probably never imagined that the seemingly worthless rocks beneath his farmland would one day be more valuable than the land itself. Yet somehow, with the foresight of a man who had endured the Depression, he had protected it. Oh, Sarah, Jake said quietly, I want every one of these bastards prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Not for the money, but for every farmer who's ever lost their land to schemes like this. The taste of righteous anger was stronger than any coffee. Marlene had thought she was swindling some naive country boy who wouldn't fight back. Instead, she had chosen to pick a fight with 3 generations of relentless American grit, supported by federal law and mineral rights valuable enough to buy half the county. Jake's great-grandfather had always insisted that if the family cared for the land would care for the family. 6 decades later, the old man's words were still holding true. Now, it was time for Marlene to pay for underestimating both the land and the family. Sarah Bennett's law office transformed into Command Central, and Jake quickly realized that. Legal battles demanded the same meticulous attention as rebuilding a diesel engine, except instead of nuts, bolts, and wrenches, they were assembling evidence and allies. First, we clear your title entirely, Sarah explained, spreading papers across the conference table like a general plotting a campaign. A quiet title action removes any cloud over your ownership. Second, we file suit against the HOA for fraudulent liens and attempted theft. Third, we pursue federal charges for homestead fraud. But Sarah's true brilliance lay in calling in reinforcements. She reached out to Maria Santos, a civil rights attorney specializing in housing discrimination. One glance at Marlene's recorded remarks about protecting community standards and unsuitable residents convinced Maria there was a clear pattern. Rural landowners were being targeted for their class and lifestyle. This isn't just property fraud, Maria said, her voice carrying the fierce authority of someone who had spent her career battling corporate bullies. This is systematic discrimination cloaked as community improvement. Jake's role was to meticulously document damages, like a mechanic logging every repair. Every legal expense, every lost workday, every fix caused by deliberate sabotage. The figures were staggering: $43,000 in direct costs, plus lost agricultural revenue and unfinished property improvements while entrenched in legal combat. The real game changer was Buck Hawkins and his financial forensics. The retired state trooper had an uncanny skill for tracing money, and the HOA's books revealed corruption that could embarrass any politician. They've been stripping this HOA for 3 years, Buck said, his weathered fingers pointing at spreadsheet entries totaling grand larceny, inflated legal fees funneled to Bradford's brother-in-law, phantom consulting contracts to Marlene's shell companies, and maintenance agreements 3 times above market to barely existent firms. Even more incriminating were emails Buck obtained through law enforcement contacts. Marlene and Bradford had meticulously plotted the mineral rights acquisition for over 2 years, identifying target properties and crafting phony legal justifications for foreclosures. Meanwhile, Jake rallied his rural allies. Pete Kowalski brought in issues from his horse ranch. Betty Morrison contributed secret recordings of HOA meetings, and 3 other Harris landowners joined as co-plaintiffs, transforming personal attacks into a full-blown class action conspiracy case. Community support was immense. Jake's former boss at Morrison's Diesel launched a legal defense fund that raised $12,000 in just 2 weeks. The local Farmers Association unanimously pledged expert witnesses on agricultural practices. Even the Methodist Church, attended by Jake's family for generations, offered their fellowship hall for strategy sessions. Sarah coordinated every move with military precision. The quiet title action went in on Monday, the fraud lawsuit on Wednesday, and the federal complaint by Friday. By the next Monday, Marlene faced legal strikes on 4 fronts simultaneously. Jake approached his personal preparation with the same rigor. He took temporary leave from the mechanic shop to focus solely on the battle. His children, Emma and Tyler, moved back full-time to manage cattle operations. Even his ex-wife, Patricia, despite a complicated past, provided paralegal support. During evening strategy sessions, Sarah's strategy also included psychological warfare. Instead of avoiding media attention, they leveraged it. Tom Bradley's newspaper series had drawn statewide agricultural notice, and Sarah arranged interviews portraying Jake as the emblem of rural property rights, standing firm against corporate overreach. Every time Marlene spotted your face in the paper, Sarah said, it reminded her that this issue wasn't going to disappear quietly. Corporate bullies rely on their targets staying silent and isolated. But Jake's favorite part of all the preparations was the security enhancements. With Buck Hawkins' help, he had installed a surveillance system worthy of FBI standards. Every corner of Jake's property was now under watch, with cameras feeding directly into cloud storage. If Marlene attempted any sabotage, she'd be handing over video evidence for federal prosecution. The aroma of fresh coffee, mixed with determination, filled Sarah's conference room during their final strategy meeting. Maps lined the walls, detailing property boundaries, mineral surveys, and HOA limits. Evidence boxes were stacked high, overflowing with phone logs, financial records, and printed emails, every piece forming a trail that traced directly back to Marlene's scheme. Jake, Sarah said, reviewing their timeline one last time. In 60 days, we'll present this case to a federal judge. Everything must be flawless. Leaning back in his chair, Jake thought about his great-grandfather, who had cleared this land armed with nothing but grit and sheer determination. That old man had faced depression, drought, and economic collapse, and Marlene Whitfield was just another hurdle to overcome. Sarah, Jake said, his voice echoing 3 generations of stubborn resolve, we're not just presenting this case. We're going to dismantle them so thoroughly that no HOA will ever pull this scam again. The taste of justice was sweeter than honey, and Jake was ready to serve it. Cornered animals are dangerous, and Marlene Whitfield was about to discover just how vicious a suburban predator could be when her $1 million plan began to unravel. The sabotage started subtly. Jake's cattle water troughs, reliable sources of clean water for decades, were suddenly tainted with motor oil. 30 black Angus cattle circled the contaminated troughs, thirsty and bewildered as Jake scrambled to flush the systems and provide emergency water. That lessons from his grandfather's stories about old-school range wars had prepared him. Desperation always leaves a trail. Every tainted trough was photographed, every gallon of ruined water recorded, and every veterinary bill meticulously cataloged. Next came the fence cutting. Jake woke to find the eastern boundary fence sliced in 3 spots, letting his entire herd wander onto County Road. 18 at 5 a.m., the sound of 18-wheelers swerving to avoid cattle was the kind of alarm that ages a man a decade in 10 seconds. Buck Hawkins' cameras had captured the whole operation. At 2:17 a.m., a figure dressed in dark clothing methodically cut the fence wire with bolt cutters. The person moved with precision, knowing exactly where to strike for maximum chaos while skillfully avoiding the main surveillance cameras as if they had studied the ranch layout in advance. Jake spent 6 grueling hours rounding up the herd with help from neighboring ranchers. Diesel fumes and road dust filled the air, mixing with his growing anger. Yet his analytical mind was already working. The saboteur had avoided the obvious cameras, but hadn't accounted for the wildlife cameras monitoring creek crossings. When Buck reviewed the wildlife footage, they struck gold. Bradford Whitfield's Mercedes, license plate clearly visible, sat on the county road at 2:15 a.m. Bradford himself, a tech executive, moonlighting as a midnight fence cutter, was caught sneaking through Jake's pasture with wire cutters and a flashlight. Amateur, Buck muttered, watching the crystal-clear footage of Bradford's trespass. 2 decades in corporate boardrooms had made him forget one simple truth. Crime demands skill, but Marlene wasn't done. Anonymous tips started pouring into the IRS about Jake's unreported agricultural income. Environmental agencies received complaints alleging he was illegally dumping chemicals into the creek. Fire inspectors reported potential propane storage violations. Each allegation triggered official investigations, legal responses, and precious time that Jake simply didn't have. The subtle twist came when Jake noticed a pattern. The types of complaints mirrored Marlene's corporate HR expertise perfectly. She was methodically deploying every tactic she'd learned in her California career, trying to drown Jake in bureaucratic chaos. Jake's response was elegantly straightforward. Rather than addressing each complaint separately, he documented the overall pattern. Sarah filed a federal harassment lawsuit detailing 23 false complaints lodged within 6 weeks, all traceable to Marlene through IP addresses and filing methods. But Marlene's desperation escalated. She attempted direct bribery. County Inspector Morrison discovered an envelope with $5,000 in cash tucked under his truck's windshield wiper, accompanied by a note implying Jake's barn could accidentally fail inspection if Morrison needed extra money. Already uneasy about the setup, Morrison immediately alerted the sheriff. The cash was photographed, fingerprinted, and linked back to a withdrawal from Marlene's personal account. Handwriting analysis sealed the case. Marlene had committed a felony while under federal scrutiny. Jake's 17-year-old son, Tyler, became an unexpected asset in the digital battle. Growing up immersed in technology, he was hyper-aware of online privacy. When Tyler noticed their home internet acting strangely slow, he uncovered someone monitoring their network from a van parked on county property. "Dad," Tyler said, pointing to his laptop showing the network traffic analysis. "Someone's been reading our emails for 3 weeks." Further investigation revealed the van belonged to a private detective firm hired by Horizon Data Solutions. Bradford had commissioned professional surveillance of Jake's legal strategy, hoping to stay ahead of the federal probe. But Bradford hadn't considered one key factor. Federal investigators do not take kindly to private citizens interfering with ongoing criminal cases. When Sarah tipped off the FBI about the electronic spying, Bradford's tech company quickly became the target of its own federal investigation for obstruction of justice. The community's response to Marlene's escalating sabotage was swift and forceful. Local ranchers began monitoring Jake's property around the clock. Murphy's Diner refused service to anyone linked to Meadowbrook Estates. The hardware store owner posted a sign, "HOA board members not welcome." Jake stood in his kitchen, listening to police radios crackle with updates on the latest incident. The bitter taste of his coffee reminded him that Marlene had been willing to poison his cattle to seize his land. Yet, every misdeed she committed only strengthened her own legal downfall. "Tyler," Jake said, watching his son secure their computer network with practice ease. "Your great-great-grandfather never imagined his land would be defended with digital forensics." Tyler grinned. "Different war, same enemy, Dad. People who think they can take what's not theirs." Outside, Jake's cattle settled into their nighttime routine, now protected by cameras, vigilant neighbors, and federal law enforcement. Marlene had pushed herself straight into federal prison. When physical sabotage failed, she resorted to psychological warfare, wielding the ruthless skills of someone who'd spent decades dismantling careers in corporate HR. The campaign of character assassination kicked off with fake social media accounts spreading rumors about Jake's supposed volatility and violent past. Anonymous posts claimed he had threatened Marlene, that his divorce was the result of domestic abuse, and that his cattle operation was actually a cover for illegal activities. Each fabrication was carefully constructed to sound believable to anyone who didn't know Jake personally. That Marlene had overlooked the power of small-town loyalty. Within hours of the first bogus post, Jake's ex-wife, Patricia, issued a public Facebook response that utterly dismantled Marlene's lies. "I've known Jake Riverside for 22 years, been married to him for 15, and divorced for reasons that had nothing to do with his character," Patricia wrote. "He is one of the most honest, hardworking men I have ever met. Anyone spreading falsehoods about him is either misinformed or malicious. I suspect the latter." The post racked up 300 likes and 47 shares within a single day. Jake's diesel, mechanic clients, cattle buyers, and 3 generations of neighbors flooded in with testimonials painting him as exactly what he was: a decent man protecting his family's legacy from corporate opportunists, Sarah meticulously documented every fake profile, false post, and act of online defamation. Cyberstalking and harassment carry serious consequences, particularly when tied to an ongoing federal investigation. Marlene was unknowingly constructing her own legal downfall, one lie at a time. The situation became far more dangerous when Marlene began targeting Jake's children. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services alleged that Emma and Tyler were living in unsafe conditions on the ranch. Complaints cited inadequate supervision, exposure to dangerous farm equipment, and the presence of an unstable father. CPS investigation was invasive and thorough. Social workers interviewed the children at school, inspected every structure on the ranch, and spoke with neighbors about Jake's parenting. Fear and bureaucratic pressure permeated Jake's kitchen as he answered endless questions about his children's well-being. Emma, now 18 and fiercely protective, recorded her CPS interview with permission. "My father is the most responsible person I know," she told the social worker. "Anyone claiming otherwise has never seen him work. 8-hour days to put food on our table and keep our cattle healthy." Within 2 weeks, the CPS case was dismissed, yet the toll was real. Jake had to hire a family law attorney, miss work for interviews, and explain to his children why strangers were scrutinizing their safety. The emotional strain was precisely what Marlene had intended. Jake's response, however, was nothing short of brilliant. Rather than retreating from the smear campaign, he embraced transparency. Tom Bradley's newspaper published a feature on a day in the life of Jake Riverside, complete with photos of him tending cattle, fixing machinery, and helping his kids with homework. The most impactful moment came when Tyler, 17 and remarkably mature, spoke directly to the camera. "People are lying about my dad because he won't let them steal our family's land," he said. "That tells you everything. You need to know about who's right and who's wrong." Marlene's final desperate maneuver revealed just how deep the corruption ran. She attempted to bribe Jake with a $50,000 settlement to drop all lawsuits and quietly transfer the mineral rights to Meadowbrook Estates Development Corporation. The offer came through an intermediary, a lawyer Jake had never encountered representing concerned community members who wanted to avoid protracted litigation. $50,000 for mineral rights valued at $2.3 million. The insulting lowball offer proved Marlene still saw him as a clueless farmer, unaware of his land's true worth. Sarah's reaction was brilliant. She immediately organized a press conference to publicly address the HOA settlement proposal, inviting every media outlet within a 100-mile radius. The image of Jake standing proudly before his great-grandfather's barn, refusing petty cash for his family's legacy, dominated headlines in 3 counties. $50,000 for $2.3 million in mineral rights, Jake declared to the cameras, his voice echoing the pride of 3 generations. "This isn't a settlement. It's proof they planned to rob me from the start." The twist that ultimately doomed Marlene came from her own desperation. In a recorded phone call with the intermediary lawyer, a call Buck Hawkins had anticipated. And legally captured, she completely lost control. "Just threaten him with bankruptcy," she instructed, her tone unmistakable. "Threaten his kids' college funds. Threaten everything he owns. Bradford's connections at Chesapeake are getting impatient. We need those mineral rights transferred before the federal investigation digs any deeper." Bradford Whitfield finally realized the cost of his wife's recklessness. Within 24 hours, he filed for divorce and secured his own legal representation. Horizon Data Solutions publicly distanced itself from any HOA involvement. Even Marlene's own board members began resigning, hoping to avoid criminal exposure. That evening, Jake watched his cattle graze peacefully in the pasture, the same sunset his great-grandfather had admired countless times before. Victory tasted sweet, but the fight wasn't over. Tomorrow, the county would witness Marlene's ultimate public disgrace. The county commissioners' meeting on October 15th wasn't just about property rights, it was about justice. By 7 a.m., 2 hours before the session began, the courthouse steps were packed. Farmers in crisp work shirts stood shoulder to shoulder with suburban families, united by one principle: stealing land is wrong. No matter who tries it, 3 local TV stations had set up cameras, their reporters interviewing anyone willing to speak about the HOA scandal that shook rural America. Jake arrived early with Sarah, both carrying boxes filled with months of carefully collected evidence. The courthouse lobby buzzed with nervous energy and the aroma of fresh coffee as supporters wished him luck. Betty Morrison, 83 and as tough as a badger, patted his arm. Hands that had worked this land longer than Marlene had lived carried a sense of authority. "Your great-grandfather would be proud, son," she said, her voice echoing the resilience of someone who had survived the Depression, 2 wars, and countless bureaucratic battles. Marlene showed up 15 minutes late, wearing an extravagant suit and flanked by a lawyer whose demeanor screamed $500 an hour billing. Her usual air of confidence was fraying at the edges, dark circles under her eyes, hands quivering ever so slightly as she arranged her documents, the look of someone who could feel the walls closing in. The commissioner's chamber was packed. Standing room only. County Commissioner Williams, whose family had farmed the land for 4 generations, called the meeting to order with unusual formality. "We're gathered to examine allegations of improper changes to property records and potential abuse of HOA authority over agricultural lands." Sarah's presentation hit like a hammer, precise, relentless. She opened with the timeline showing how Jake's property had mysteriously been added to the HOA registry in 2019 without his knowledge. She exposed the fabricated justification, noting claims that Jake was absent when he could prove he'd worked on the land every day that month. Then she revealed the financial motive: $2.3 million in mineral rights that Chesapeake Energy hoped to seize through HOA foreclosure. "This isn't just petty neighborhood squabbling," Sarah told the crowded chamber, her voice carrying too. The back where farmers stood with arms crossed. "This is industrial theft disguised as community management." The audience murmured in outrage as Sarah displayed Bradford's surveillance records, contaminated water troughs, cut fences, and attempts at bribery. Every violation was backed by photographs, police reports, and precise timestamps, weaving a picture of deliberate, organized criminal conduct. But the moment that shattered Marlene came when Sarah played the audio of Marlene speaking with the intermediary lawyer, her own unmistakable voice confessing to the entire plot to steal Jake's mineral rights for Chesapeake Energy, just threaten him with bankruptcy, threaten his kids' college funds. "We need those mineral rights moved before the federal investigation digs any deeper." The room fell into stunned silence. 200 people had just heard Marlene admit to extortion, conspiracy, and attempting to steal an entire family's legacy. Several commissioners looked pale. The high-priced lawyer beside her scribbled furiously, likely calculating how fast he could exit the case. Marlene tried desperately to recover. She stood, voice rising to the familiar shriek that had terrorized the neighborhood for months. "This is a witch hunt. Jake Riverside is an unfit property owner who fails to maintain community standards. His agricultural operations don't fit with residential development." The subtle but unmistakable undertones of racism rang clear. Jake embodied everything Marlene despised about rural life: honest labor, generational stability, and independence from corporate control. Her facade had crumbled, revealing entitlement and bigotry underneath. That's when federal agent Rebecca Torres emerged from the back. Not the county clerk, this was FBI Special Agent Torres, who had been investigating the case for 3 weeks. Mrs. Marlene Whitfield, Agent Torres said, badge clearly visible as she approached the defendant's table. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft of federal homestead land, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The courtroom erupted instantly. Camera flashes exploded across the room as handcuffs snapped around Marlene's wrists. Her high-priced attorney was already retreating, clearly eager to distance himself from a federal RICO case. The crowd's cheers thundered so loudly they shook the old courthouse windows, but it was Jake's words that made the moment unforgettable. Standing at the podium, carrying the quiet dignity of 3 generations, he faced the cameras directly. This was never about me versus the HOA, he declared, his voice firm and unwavering. This was about defending every American's right to own property without fear of corporate theft. My great-grandfather homesteaded this land with nothing but grit and honest labor. Today, those same principles triumphed over greed and corruption. The standing ovation went on for 3 full minutes. Commissioner Williams called for order, yet even he was dabbing at his eyes. Outside, car horns blared in celebration. Inside, Marlene was escorted away in handcuffs, every humiliating step captured by the cameras. Justice had been delivered, in full force, witnessed by all who mattered and recorded for history. 6 months later, Jake returned to the very hill where it all began. But everything had changed for the better. The legal outcomes were decisive. Marlene pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges, receiving 18 months in federal prison and 3 years of supervised probation. Bradford's divorce concluded with him losing half his assets to cover restitution. The corrupt county clerk, Rebecca Torres, was fired and faced criminal charges for falsifying public records. More significantly, the county introduced the Riverside Protocol, new rules requiring certified mail notifications to all property owners before registry changes, plus a mandatory 30-day appeal period. Sarah Bennett was appointed to the new Property Rights Review Board, ensuring no family would endure what Jake had faced. The financial outcome exceeded everyone's expectations. The HOA was ordered to pay Jake $347,000 in damages, legal fees, and punitive awards. Chesapeake Energy, humiliated by the scandal, offered Jake a legitimate mineral rights lease valued at $2.8 million, over 15 years, far surpassing what the original fraudulent scheme would have netted the conspirators. Yet Jake's true victory was in how he used that money. He founded the Homestead Heritage Foundation, providing free legal support to rural property owners confronting corporate harassment. The foundation's inaugural case helped a Nebraska farmer triumph over an energy company that had attempted to seize his water rights through abuse of eminent domain. Every rural family deserves what my great-grandfather gave me, Jake told. The foundation's board, meeting in the same courthouse where Marlene had once been arrested. He meant the right to own land without the fear of losing it to people, armed with superior legal teams. The personal journey mattered just as much. Jake's relationship with his ex-wife, Patricia, had grown remarkably stronger through their shared struggle. She had witnessed him at his finest under extreme pressure, defending not only property but also core principles. Their children, Emma and Tyler, developed a newfound admiration for their father's quiet resilience and the deep roots of their family. Jake scaled back his mechanic work to part-time, channeling his energy into expanding the cattle operation. With income from his mineral rights, the ranch now supported 50 head of premium Black Angus, with plans for organic certification and direct-to-consumer beef sales. Emma, now studying agricultural law in college, planned to join Sarah's practice. After graduation, the ripple effect extended to the state legislature. Senator Patricia Hawkins, whose family had experienced the loss of farmland to corporate manipulation, introduced the Rural Property Protection Act. The legislation mandated that property owners receive notifications before registry changes, created appeal procedures for disputed HOA authority, and imposed harsh penalties for fraudulent land acquisition schemes. Jake testified at the state capitol, recounting his story to lawmakers who recognized that protecting rural property rights was essential to maintaining rural votes. The bill passed unanimously, with Marlene's mugshot displayed prominently during floor debates about corporate land theft. Yet Jake's proudest outcome was the annual Freedom Ranch Days festival held each October on his property. What had begun as a celebration of his legal triumph had evolved into a cherished community tradition honoring rural values and the sanctity of property rights. Locals brought picnic baskets, kids got hands-on lessons about cattle ranching, and live music floated across the same pastures Marlene once tried to claim. This year's festival attracted more than 800 visitors. Tom Bradley's newspaper reported it as a triumph of justice. Local officials gave speeches emphasizing the importance of protecting family farms. Sarah Bennett was recognized as Rural Attorney of the Year by the State Bar Association. The conservation easement Jake put in place safeguarded 500 acres forever, guaranteeing his great-grandfather's land would never be turned into strip malls or suburban sprawl. The dedication plaque on the easement read simply, "Preserved for future generations by the Riverside family, American farmers since 1960. As the sun set, Jake stood on his hill, watching cattle roam where Marlene had planned gas wells, children laugh where she'd imagined commercial buildings, and families gather where she'd plotted corporate exploitation. The air carried the sweet scent of triumph, mingling with the earthy aromas of hay, cattle, and soil, the same land his great-grandfather had entrusted to him. His phone buzzed with a message from a farmer in Oregon facing similar HOA harassment. Sarah's law practice was now stretching nationwide, taking on agricultural rights cases coast to coast. The foundation had supported 12 victorious defenses against corporate land grabs in 6 different states. Jake smiled, remembering his great-grandfather's belief that if the family took care of the land would take care of the family. 60 years later, that promise was still holding true. Now it's your turn. Share your worst HOA nightmare in the comments, and tell us if this story gives you hope to stand up to petty tyrants. Hit subscribe if you love seeing the underdog triumph over corrupt systems. We've got plenty more property rights battles on the horizon. After all, American land belongs to American families, not corporate exploiters. That's it for today's HO Showdown. If watching justice unfold brightened your day, smash that like button, leave your thoughts below, and make sure you're subscribed. More jaw-dropping neighborhood confrontations are coming soon.